You're listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, today featuring Buck Hodges, announcing the global release of Azure DevOps.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to another edition, or the first edition of the Azure DevOps Podcast. Go online to www.azuredevops.show to see show notes and other episodes. I'm really excited to speak with today's guest, Buck Hodges. Buck is the Director of Engineering for the new Azure DevOps product group and has been at Microsoft for over 15 years. Buck, welcome.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks for having me on the show. It's exciting times.
Absolutely. So there is a brand new announcement, and I think you're the guy to tell us all about it.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So we've announced that a new set of services called Azure DevOps Services. Previously, of course, the team and the product was called Visual Studio Team Services. But with this, what we're really communicating is that Azure is a developer-first cloud. Azure has a set of services that help developers to ship faster. And that's really what it's all about these days. Everybody I talk to is always looking, how do they ship faster? How do they get customer value out more quickly? How do they improve their agility and their quality? And DevOps is just a really hot topic, of course, with everybody trying to move forward at a more rapid pace. And so with Azure DevOps Services, we give you a full set of services that you can use either separately or with, let's say, combined with other non-Microsoft services, or you can use the full suite of services all together. And that's also part of this change, in addition to the name and the brand, is really how these services are positioned, where you can use them individually, use them all together, and you, in fact, for the first time, can turn off services that aren't relevant to you. So if you just want to use Pipelines, for example, which is our CI/CD solution, you can actually just have that turned on and turn off the other services that maybe aren't relevant to you because your Repose on GitHub, for example, and that's where your source control is. Great. We work great with that and want to fully support it.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about here. But for some people who might not be familiar with you, you've been at Microsoft for over 15 years. What's your progression been at the company, and how long have you been focused in the DevOps area versus some other areas?
So it's a good question. Yeah, I started in April of 2003. And when I joined the company, I started as an individual contributor, as we call them at Microsoft, a developer on Team Foundation Server at the time. And now the funny thing, of course, was when I started, it wasn't called Team Foundation Server. It really didn't have a name at all. All we had was a code name. The code name was Hatteras, which is one of the Outer Banks of North Carolina.
And that was 2003.
That was 2003.
So that was .NET 1.1 era?
That is exactly right. .NET 1.1 was just shipping as I joined. And we had a spec for a command line for a version control product. And that was it. And we built it from scratch. The rest of what became Team Foundation Server didn't even exist at the time. It wasn't until the end of 2003 that all of that started to come into the picture. Where we looked at and went, okay, we need a bug tracking product, a feature for the product, and then later build and so forth, and ultimately ship TFS 2005 in March of 2006. And so at the time, I spent 3 years as a developer on Team Foundation version control, helping build that product, and that was a lot of fun.
And that was a big step up from SourceSafe, if I recall. That was a long time ago.
Oh, yeah, it was. It was a huge step up. And so SourceSafe was a fantastic product back in its day, but the world had grown to volumes of source code and other assets under management that just had exceeded its capabilities. And so, yeah, we built a highly scalable version control system And in fact, I would argue for a centralized version control system, it's maybe the most scalable on the planet, based on not only our internal usage at Microsoft, but also some very high scale customer installations.
Right.
So from there, I was lead of the build automation team. I started doing that in April 2006. And then April of 2008 became development manager of the North Carolina office at the time, and then development director in 2010. And then the biggest change, I would say, in terms of management, also was kind of midway in our journey so far with Agile and DevOps, was in November 2014, we changed to combine test and development. So previously at Microsoft, you had software development engineers and software development engineers in test, SDEs and SDETs. And there was a lot of dysfunction in having those be separate. Test was always behind. Test tended to be a smaller team. Test was always the hardest discipline to hire for at Microsoft. The third discipline in engineering, of course, is program management. And so I could go on and on about that, but I won't. And so we combined the two into a single discipline, and that point became director of engineering in November 2014. And what was cool about that is, as an engineer, you build something, you're on the hook for the quality as well. There's no longer, hey, write it and throw it over the wall. And I think that dovetails very nicely in with the key essence of DevOps. With DevOps, if you build it, you run it. If it breaks, when it breaks, something.
You have to fix it.
Yeah, that's right. You have to fix it. If you make enough changes, something's going to go wrong. It's just the nature of software. So you build it, you test it, you deploy it, you fix it when it breaks. That's the essence of DevOps, and that change, I think, was kind of key to it. So you asked about how we made the shift to Agile and DevOps, and for us, it really started in 2010. Back then, we had made some changes to the product architecturally in the TFS 2010 release that kind of set us up going forward to be a service, but it was kind of just very early work there. But it was really the summer of 2010 when we shifted the whole team into Agile and adopted Scrum, rolled out training for the team, and went through that journey. And of course, everybody who's done it knows that, first few months of it are really rough.
It went perfectly the first time.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really rough getting to people to wrap their heads around, hey, you need to work in 3-week chunks and to be able to produce, incrementally shippable software every three weeks. So, and then, like I say, as we got into 2014, we made the transformation to combine dev and test all across Microsoft into a single engineering discipline. And by that point in 2014, we had the service up and running. Service stood up for real April 23rd, 2011, if I remember correctly. And from that point forward, everything was an upgrade versus, before that we had some test installs and we tear it all apart and delete it all and start over. So starting in April 2011, everything was an upgrade. And we've progressed a long ways. When we started shipping, we shipped every few months. It was kind of unpredictable. In 2012, we shifted to shipping at the end of each sprint every 3 weeks, which of course really met the spirit of Scrum. You want to produce shippable software, well, just put it in production.
Right.
And
what could go wrong?
Yeah. And early on, a lot of stuff did go wrong. And we learned a lot of lessons the hard way around everything from telemetry and on-call rotations and being prepared to mitigate issues in life site and production. In the interim, the team's grown a bunch. There are now about 36 services that comprise Azure DevOps Services. Some of them you see, some of them you don't. There's services behind the scenes that do things that you as an end user can't actually interface with. And going forward, our plan is to continue to improve our shipping velocity. We're starting to make some changes that will ultimately get us to the point where we can just ship all the time. In an ideal world, every time a commit goes into master, you'd be able to ship that into production. And that's where we're headed, to a true continuous delivery future.
Well, I remember back in the Visual Studio team system days and the installs, and it's a different world. Every 3 weeks, having a new version, or you just click, boom, you have a new instance online for a customer. I know we implement new accounts. It's so easy now with the cloud version, but let's talk about the fundamental difference with the rebranding to Azure DevOps, because even so many customers, their world is, oh, okay, if we're going to go to what has been VSTS, okay, how are we going to move our work items? How are we going to move our source control, move our builds? They probably don't have deployments yet, but they have to, all or nothing. And now with Azure DevOps, it's organized very differently. You split things up, right?
Yeah. So a couple of things on that. If you are using Team Foundation Server, of course, you can import that whole server into Azure DevOps, which is great. And that's one of the benefits of having things be architecturally and design compatible to be able to do that kind of import. But you're right. So we have 5 services: Azure Pipelines, Azure Boards, Azure Artifacts, Azure Repos, and Azure Test Plans. And I'll talk quickly about each one. Azure Pipelines is our CI/CD solution that works with any language, any platform, and any cloud. So you can deploy using your source being on Azure DevOps itself and Azure in the repo service that I'll talk about in a second. It could be on GitHub. It could be somewhere else, and you can deploy it anywhere. And in fact, one of probably the most surprising things is for folks is we have customers who use AWS, and in fact the set of build tasks in the marketplace for AWS has over 6,100 installs. And it's actually produced by Amazon themselves, and it's really cool to have that. Google Cloud folks recently published a set of instructions to use Azure Pipelines with, of course, at the time it was called awesome. VSTS with Google Cloud Platform. So we really are multi-platform, and of course, you pick your language. And one of the coolest things about Azure Pipelines is we have hosted agents for all 3 major platforms. So we have Windows agents, we have Mac agents, and we have Linux. So whatever you're building, we probably have the right hosted agents for you, unless it's something truly esoteric. Azure Boards is how you track your work, and that's Kanban boards, it's backlogs, it's team dashboards, and of course, your typical bug management as well. Artifacts is all about maintaining and managing packages, and that could be Maven, it could be NPM if you're using Node, NuGet, and that could be pulling packages from public and private feeds. You can also produce your own feeds through Artifacts. Repose is the name of our source hosting, so that's Git, of course, and you can either use Azure Repos, you could certainly use GitHub obviously being very popular. So with Repos, you've got pull requests. You can do interesting things like branch policies, where you can set a policy that says every time that you issue a pull request, it's got to be reviewed by, let's say, 2 code reviewers, and that when the pull request kicks off is created, you want to kick off a build with it. You can, in fact, do the same thing with GitHub, too. You could connect to GitHub and be able to have your pull requests on GitHub trigger builds in Azure Pipelines as well. And the last one I'll talk about here is Azure Test Plans. And that's really geared toward test planning and exploratory testing, sometimes called manual testing. The automated testing for Azure DevOps is really integrated in a lot of ways with pipelines. So, for example, our team, we run a bunch of unit tests every time somebody submits a pull request. So we submit a pull request, we kick off a build, and we run about 82,000 unit tests right now for every pull request.
That's a lot of tests, definitely. It's probably more tests than a lot of our listeners have. But one other thing in the Azure repos kind of glossed over that a lot of people I don't think know, and it's certainly if they're coming from TFS, where you have one project and one repository. With the Git repository, you can have any number of source control repositories for a single project.
That's right.
And so for the microservices world, that's a lot of options.
It is. So you can have a single team project, as you said, and you could have 100 repos in that team project if you wanted to. And so if you had a bunch of services and you wanted them all to have their own individual repos, it works beautifully for that.
And what about those customers that are just completely entrenched with tracking all of their work in Jira? Are they able to adopt Azure DevOps?
Absolutely. So if you want to use Jira, by all means, you can use Jira and use Azure Pipelines, Azure Repose with it. It works well with that. Our goal is to really meet customers where they are and give them the services that they need, and not force people to have to adopt the whole thing wholesale. It really is a collection of services, and of course, all 5 services work phenomenally well together, and you can treat them as a suite if you want to. But if you're a Jira customer, you're not locked in and having to switch. You can just start using Azure Pipelines or Azure Repos today.
I think that's a huge benefit of the new Azure DevOps organization, is just being able to use one to start with, not the other. Because I know a lot of our customers, just the thought of switching everything all at once, just the mental weight of that kind of causes paralysis in any movement.
Yeah, it's kind of a terrifying thing to try to think about. Oh, I'm going to shift everything at once. Wow, I'm going to be down. I'm going to have a bunch of problems. And being able to adopt something incrementally is just so much smoother.
Yeah, and there's so many, and the Fortune 500, they're so sophisticated. We deal with so many customers in the mid-market, non-technology, and they have their source control hosted. Maybe it's in GitHub or somewhere, but they don't have automated deployments, and half of them don't have any kind of automated build. So that's the perfect entry point for, their work is tracked somewhere already, their source is tracked somewhere already, but they don't have the right build and deployment capabilities, and maybe they have some automated tests that are kicked off manually, but it's just a really good entry point.
That's right. I agree.
So one thing that y'all announced just recently was for open source, that for open source projects, it's free.
That's right. That was one of the most exciting things about the announcements this week, is that Microsoft has a huge commitment to open source. Obviously, we acquired GitHub, or announced the acquisition of GitHub back in June. Microsoft is the largest contributor to open source on GitHub. And so as a company, we are firmly committed to open source and doing it well. And part of what we want to do is give back. We're open source contributors, we're open source consumers. And one way we can give back as part of Azure here is to give people the ability to run free builds for any open source project. And that project might be on GitHub, or it might be hosted somewhere else. But as long as the repo has, you can publicly authenticate to it, there's no username and password to it, then you can use this to run your builds. It's 10 free pipelines with unlimited minutes for CI and CD, so build and release. So what does that mean? 10 free pipelines means that you can have 10 builds running simultaneously. And, in the most extreme, you could have them running, all the time. You could have 10 concurrent builds running all the time, running, let's say, doing PR builds for every pull request. I think for the vast majority of open source projects, that's roughly the equivalent of infinite. But in the case where somebody needs more, great, reach out to me. Be happy to work with you to give you whatever access you need. And this, of course, includes, I mentioned earlier that we have Windows, Linux, and Mac machines in our hosted pools. You get access to all 3 of those platforms with this free OSS offer. So, which I don't think anybody else can compare to that. I don't know that anybody else in the industry has free access or provides free access to open source to all 3 platforms simultaneously. So it's a really big deal, and I'm super excited about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited about how many projects are likely to jump on board, because with as complete as the marketplace is, click, you have an automated build, package it up, store it in essentially the embedded NuGet server, and then even for open source libraries, there still does need to be a deployment pipeline, even if the deployment production environment is the public NuGet.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's right. And being able to automate all that stuff is such a wonderful thing. It takes burden off of people, right? If today, every time somebody submits a pull request, you as a contributor or a maintainer are on the hook for finding a way to deal with that. This takes all that burden away from you and just makes you more productive. So you mentioned the marketplace. Azure Pipelines is also now available in the GitHub Marketplace. So as you were kind of saying there, you can go to the GitHub Marketplace, click and get started immediately and get everything hooked up and running with very little friction. It's just a really easy process. And it's pretty cool. We're starting to see OSS projects get on board. We reached out to some ahead of the announcement, and including projects like Atom, and of course Visual Studio Code and TypeScript also are big users of Azure Pipelines. So there'll be many more coming on board here, and it's just really exciting. I'm so glad to be able to support open source this way.
Awesome. And with that, we'll break for a word from our sponsor.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
And we're back. So over time, I've heard a few bits and pieces, and I know you've shared some information publicly about the huge internal transformation that your group has gone through. Things like completely integrating the SDET job. Mm-hmm. So many folks still have separated groups. What is the organization of the Azure DevOps teams? How does it look today?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you're right. I was kind of touching on that earlier when I mentioned that in November 2014, we combined test and dev into a single engineering discipline. And it really changed a lot of things for us. In the past, the traditional organization was one or two program managers, and then you'd have a dev lead with order of 6 to 8 developers, and then a test lead, usually with 4 to 5, maybe 6 tops, test engineers working for the test lead. And what ended up happening, of course, is you needed more coordination. The development team was having to coordinate with the test team. As I mentioned before, lots of dysfunction there. The development team would inevitably get ahead of the test team because, like I said, it was typically larger. The developers also looked at it as, hey, there's a test team over there. They're the people who write tests. They're the people who are on the hook for quality. And of course, that just leads to all kinds of bad problems, including things like untestable code. Over the years, I'd run into testers who were telling me these, basically terrible tales of what they were trying to do to be able to test some code. And I thought, that's just crazy. If the person who wrote the code had to write the test, there's no way they would let the tests be that hard to write.
Right.
So, today we have a single engineering discipline. So dev and test combined. Nominal team is about 10 engineers reporting to an engineering lead in the case of my team. Other teams across Microsoft have, Microsoft being a big company, you can find different variants across the company. But that's the sort of canonical setup that we've gone to. So it's typically 1 to 2 PMs. A lot of teams have 2 program managers, a single engineering lead, and 10 engineers. And that comprises what we call a feature team. And in the old days, when it was dev, test, and PM, we called it a feature team. We still call it a feature team. It's just the composition of that feature team has now changed. And the engineering leads report to group engineering managers who report to me as director. So that's kind of the basic structure of the team.
And how many developers overall are in your organization now?
So my organization, it's about 350 engineers. And then we also have a team in India. And how many engineers there? Probably another 180 or something like that. So it's a big team. We've got on the order of, I know the math's not going to work out here. We've got on the order of 500 people who commit to the main repo for the services every single sprint. And the reason the math doesn't always work out is my head's really bad about remembering how many people are in each part of the org. But yeah, it's on the order of 500 engineers total working on Azure DevOps.
Okay. Now, this system is much larger than any system that many of our listeners are working on. But just to understand how you have leveraged your own product, can you give kind of a rundown on how it's organized? How many team projects do you have for the whole Azure DevOps product, and how many Git repositories, and how do you separate those?
Yeah, fundamentally, it's one team project, and which is somewhat surprising, I think, to some people, given the size of the team. But we manage it as one team project because we really ship two products. We ship what was previously called Team Foundation Server that will now be called Azure DevOps Server with the launch of TFS 2019 next year. And of course, Azure DevOps services that are in the cloud. And the whole team is oriented around that. And so the ship dates are common, the sprint cadence is common, and so forth. So it really makes a lot of sense to manage it all together as a single team project. The code is all in a single repo. Now, where that's not true, of course, is we have open source tasks for pipelines. So the build tasks, release tasks, there are many of those that are up on GitHub. All the core ones are open source. And so that obviously is separate. But when you kind of look at everything that's not open source, it's in one single repo. And the reason we did that is it's much easier way to work. A few years back, as we were trying to figure out how to scale Git, for the Windows team in particular, we tried experimenting with having a bunch of different repositories. And we found for us, in the way that we work, it was pretty painful. The platform team, so we have a common shared services framework that we use for each of the about 36 services that we build. And that allows us economies of scale, but it also means that, if you have a change that needs to propagate, well, if you've got different repos for everything, then you make a change here, or you find a bug in one repo, you go make the change in another repo, you got to propagate everything through. It was painful. Now, a different organization, different way of setting things up, obviously the answer could be different, but for us, it was particularly painful. So we tried multiple repos, found it painful, and collapsed back into a single repo.
And how many independent services would you say the system is comprised of now?
About 36. So
okay.
What you see, so I mentioned earlier, Azure DevOps is 5 services: pipelines, boards, artifacts, repos, and test plans. And it's a true statement in the services you can see aspect, but there's a whole bunch of stuff kind of behind the scenes. There are other services that aren't, quote, top line services. Take search, for example. You bring up Azure DevOps and you go to the search bar and you type in searching for code or for work item or whatever. And there's a separate microservice that runs all of that, but it's not a headline service, if you will. And then we've got a bunch of services that do behind the scenes things. So there's a commerce service to handle, charging for users and so forth. There's an identity service. There's a licensing service, et cetera. So various services in the background that you don't see that make the whole system go. And so it's kind of a funny thing too, calling boards and so forth services, and yet I'm saying 36. So the 5 versus 36 kind of sounds like a contradiction. And it's one of those things, of course, where the word service gets used for lots of things. But if I use the word service in a literal architectural sense, it's about 36. Versus when you think of it from a user standpoint, it's really 5 presented to the user.
And every system of any complexity has all these back-end jobs that start popping up that need to do certain things, and they need to be somewhat independent. So you have 36 roughly in the same Git repository. Do you build them all together, or do you split them up into different build configurations?
Right now, we just build them all together for a couple of reasons, but primary reason is really because, roughly speaking, what we ship in the cloud, we also ship on premises. So Azure DevOps Server is fundamentally the same set of capabilities. So you've got your source code, your pipeline equivalent functionality, package management, so forth. So we want to keep that working all the time. We ship Azure DevOps Server several times a year. And if you're not building and testing it, of course, stuff will break. And if you don't know where you stand, chances are, you're going to have a hard time getting it out the door on any reasonable cadence. So we build everything together. We test it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, our North Star is to get to continuous delivery, and we're starting to make changes to go down that road. And, we'll have to evolve how we do things. And quite honestly, I don't have the answers yet. It's literally something that we are working on right now. Mm-hmm. But figuring out how do we let everything ship independently, but at the same time be able to build it all and bring it back together for an on-prem release. So we've got some interesting things to kind of sort out there.
Yeah, that's a good point of which things need to ship independently. I think just myself, I'd be surprised if you found that 36 things needed to each ship independently. More course groupings perhaps.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, so a couple things. I should also be clear before somebody walks away thinking, wow, you ship 36 services at a time, and we don't actually. So what we do today is it's a single build, but then people decide what to deploy and what schedule and so forth. Like, we don't tell people, hey, everybody's got to deploy today. Now, we have a general guidance that at the end of each sprint, you start rolling it out. You roll out by rings. Not surprisingly, the core services around pipelines, repos, boards have the most scale units, as we call them, the production stamps. And we have 5 rings for that. And so we'll roll out ring by ring for it. But it rolls out independently of the identity service, which rolls out independently of the search service, which rolls out independently of the commerce service. So the build is common, the release branch is common, but each team, ships when they're ready. We also have team shipping every day in that you can check into the release branch, and people do. We ship a lot of changes every day. It's just the sprint payloads right now ship every 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. But every day something's changing on the service, multiple deployments per day. So, in that sense, there is some continuous delivery already there, but it's not, sort of a more pure form of continuous delivery that we want to get to. So,
right.
And the other thing is it also depends on who owns what. Like, if you have a team that owns multiple services, that team may choose to ship 2 or 3 services on a similar cadence just because for that set of 10, 12 people, maybe that's easier. And if that's what they want to do, I'm okay with that. I give folks the flexibility to choose what works best for them.
Awesome. So the look and feel is a lot different for Azure DevOps, and I think what's coming next in the next couple of sprints that you have maybe already started work on.
Yeah, so you're right. We just recently updated the UI. We started rolling that out earlier this summer. It got a huge positive reaction. It has a very modern feel, which is the reaction to it was just really, really kind of blew me away. I knew that the UI was a lot better, and I was expecting a positive reaction, but I was still amazed at just how overwhelming that response was. So, follow up to that, a couple of things. One is when we rolled it out, we got feedback that, hey, it would be better. We need to make some fixes around team navigation, for example. And we've got a great way to collect feedback. So if somebody either wants to leave feedback, they can click on the avatar and they can send us feedback. Or if you opt out of a feature, let's say you turn on the navigation UI and then you find that something was hard to do. If you turn it off, we prompt you to tell us why. And certainly anybody listening to this, I'd encourage everybody to write something in there, because we literally go through all of it. So when we had the new UI on for, I don't know, a few weeks, a month or something, we had something like 3,000, 3,500 comments from people.
Oh, wow.
And we went through every single one of them. So the program managers divided them up. They went through all of them. They categorized them. They looked for themes and patterns. You name it, which was really cool. So, I know sometimes people look at it and go, I could leave feedback, but does anybody really care, right? Is it just a tree falling in the forest with nobody there to hear it? But in fact, we do look at every bit of it. And the other thing that was interesting to me when we released it was just the passion around wanting theming. Themes were the biggest, sort of most popular request coming back out of, hey, I sure would love a dark theme. The dark theme was, when I say theming, it really is about the dark theme.
Right.
And
for those dark Visual Studio folks.
That's exactly right. Yeah, just dark Visual Studio, dark Visual Studio Code. Why can't I have dark Azure DevOps? Like, makes total sense. Well, Microsoft runs this cool event every year in July called Hackathon. And it's the Microsoft 1 week hackathon. It lasts, it's usually in the third week of July. We did it this year, and the team that owns the web platform and owns all the code for the new look and feel, they thought, well, we could go do this and this wouldn't be that hard. And they actually went and knocked it out as part of the hackathon. Now, as with all hackathon projects, at the end of a hackathon, you're not truly ready to ship it. So there are some things that have to be cleaned up and fixed. But they made a ton of progress on it to the point that I'm like, man, this is just so neat. So when it got turned on for our own account, I took a screenshot of it and I posted it on Twitter, and that got another huge round of positive reactions from people. So so in the next couple of sprints here, we'll turn it on for folks, and I'm actually hoping that in the next sprint, we'll be able to produce a preview of it. But we'll see. I might be overly optimistic here. But we definitely want to make sure it looks great to go with the great looking new UI.
Well, there certainly is a lot of functionality kind of being deployed at a quick clip. One, I think, misconception that I've seen some customers have is when they look at the docs, they look at Team Foundation server docs, and they've seen some indications that this that TFS 2018 might be the end of the road. And I've had one customer come and say, oh yeah, it's all going to be cloud from here on out. They're not going to ship another TFS because they looked at the docs. And I think that some of the rebranding, how are the TFS folks going to be going forward with Azure DevOps?
Well, that's just really unfortunate that we gave people the wrong message, because Team Foundation Server, now called Azure DevOps Server, is alive and well and will continue to be for quite a long time. There are a number of customers who just aren't ready to move to the cloud yet. And now, I'll admit, it's been interesting to watch. We've got a lot of very large enterprises now using Azure DevOps. The ability to import a Team Foundation Server instance into the cloud and have it become a native organization within Azure DevOps has been tremendous. And it's in fact the second highest source of engaged users on the service. It's pretty amazing. So we do see a lot of people coming into the service, but there's still a number of organizations out there that just aren't ready to move it into the cloud. So Team Foundation Server, now Azure DevOps Server, is there, will continue to be there. For how long? I don't know, but it's going to be quite a while that it continues to exist, I would imagine. And I certainly hate that, to think that they were giving people the idea from the documentation that somehow it's going to go away. One of the things that we did that was unfortunate was kind of, we could have managed like the amount of things we deprecated with 2018. I think we could have managed that better. I know one thing in particular that's given people some heartburn is we had originally said that you can no longer use XAML build, which is the old build system with TFS 2018. And we had left a key in there to be able to turn it on. And what we found, of course, was if you're a customer who had customized XAML builds, building legacy products, you're not going to go redo all those build definitions. There's no monetary value. There's only, in fact, loss in doing that. And so we made it clear with Update 2 for TFS 2018 that, hey, you can continue to run XAML builds with TFS. You can't, like, you're going to have to use an old version of VS to edit them. You're going to have to use an old version of TFS to get new build agents, etc. So we intentionally left some friction in there because it is truly deprecated in the true sense of the word, where there is no more investment in XAML builds. But we realize it's critical for customers who have existing builds of existing products that are written with the XAML build system. They need to continue to execute. And if you go upgrade to TFS 2018 Update 2 or Update 3, which will release here in about a week or so, you'll be able to run your XAML builds just fine after the upgrade. So, I think we probably scared a few people off with how we handle the messaging around deprecating some of this stuff. And that was learning on our part.
Well, the cloud moves so fast. When do you know when customers will be able to get their hands on the new Azure DevOps Server release?
So we are planning to do a pre-release of that, of the Azure DevOps Server 2019 release late in the fall. So before the end of the year, we're planning to have that out. And of course, it could change, but that's my current plan. I want to get that out. For me, one of the biggest motivators here is I want to give people on premises that same experience people are getting with new navigation UI in the cloud today. I think it's going to be a real benefit to on-prem users, and then of course all the other functionality that we've been producing that didn't make it in TFS 2018. 2018 Update 2 was the last update with features in it. Update 3 is a bug fix release, and so the 2019 release will pick up all the features that have shipped essentially in the cloud. Some of them obviously are cloud only, but basically since probably going back to February was probably about the time we snapped for Update 2. So it'll be a good chunk of value that on-prem customers will get.
Well, that's going to be here before you know it. I mean, September is kind of already passing us by.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Awesome. Well, as we wrap up, what would you suggest our listeners do to get started or go deeper with the new Azure DevOps?
Yeah, so people should go check out dev.azure.com, which is the new URL. And of course, the existing URLs at visualstudio.com will continue to work. We don't want to break anybody or introduce any kind of disruption there. So go to dev.azure.com and find out all about these services, the 5 services I mentioned: pipelines, boards, artifacts, repos, and test plans. You can also find out about our free OSS CI/CD offer, which, like I said earlier, is just super exciting and our way of giving back to the open source community.
Yeah, I think everybody can do one of those or multiple. Well, thanks so much, Buck, for visiting with me. It was great.
All right. Thanks for having me on, Jeffrey. It's been a pleasure.
And until next week, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.